It wasn't a wedding. It was a liquidation sale. In the harsh winter of 1884, a 19-year-old girl named Clara O'Malley stood in a drafty lawyer's office in Cheyenne, watching her own life being signed away for $5,000. Her stepmother didn't even look at her. She was too busy counting the banknotes. Clara was sold to a man the locals whispered about in terrified tones, a man they called the Ghost. Everyone said he was a monster who lived in the shadows. But as Clara would soon discover, the true monsters often wear the prettiest smiles, and the man she feared was the only one capable of saving her. This is the true untold story of the Sterling O'Malley affair. The wind in Cheyenne, Wyoming didn't just blow. It bit. It chewed through wool coats and settled deep in the bones, much like the dread that had taken up permanent residence in Clara Ali's chest. Inside the office of Solicitor Amos J. Pendergast, the air smelled of stale tobacco smoke, wet wool, and greed. Clara stood by the frosted window, her knuckles white, as she gripped the velvet folds of her dress, the only nice thing her father had left her before he died of consumption 3 months prior. "It is a generous offer, Augusta," Mr. Pendergast said, his voice raspy. He pushed a heavy piece of parchment across the mahogany desk. "More than generous considering the state of the Ali debts. The bank is ready to foreclose on the boarding house by Friday. This arrangement clears the ledger entirely." Augusta Ali, a woman whose beauty was hardening into something brittle and sharp like cracked porcelain, didn't hesitate. She dipped the quill into the inkwell. She was 34, only 15 years older than Clara, but her eyes held the weary calculation of a predator that had been hungry for too long. "And the conditions?" Augusta asked, her voice steady. "He takes her immediately. No courting, no long engagements, immediate possession," Pendergast confirmed, adjusting his spectacles. "Mr. Sterling is a man of particular privacy. He requires a wife to manage his estate up at Dead Man's Ridge. He does not require conversation or social delay. The carriage is already waiting out back." Clara turned from the window. "Possession," she whispered, the word tasting like ash. "Augusta, please. We can sell the jewelry. We can work. You can't just quiet Clara." Augusta snapped, not bothering to look up as she scratched her signature onto the document. "Your father was a fool who gambled away our security. He left us with nothing but a crumbling roof and a stack of IUS to every saloon keeper from here to Laram. Mr. Silas Sterling is paying $5,000. That buys me a train ticket to San Francisco and a fresh start. It buys you a roof over your head. You should be thanking me, Silas Sterling." The name sucked the oxygen out of the room in the saloons and sewing circles of Cheyenne. Silas Sterling was a ghost story used to frighten children. They said he was a bounty hunter who had turned recluse after a fire destroyed his family home 10 years ago. They said he was disfigured, a beast who wore a mask of leather to hide a face that God had turned his back on. Clear's throat, they called him the ghost of the ridge. "He has killed men," Clara stammered, tears finally spilling over. "They say he skins them, men who deserved it." "I'm sure," Augusta said dismissively, blowing on the wet ink. She stood up, smoothing her skirts. She looked at Clara, then really looked at her with a chilling lack of affection. Clara had her father's eyes soft, green, and kind. Augusta hated them. "You are 19, Clara. You are plain. You have no dowry, and you are destitute. Being the wife of a rich monster is better than being a beggar on the street. Now wipe your face. Mr. Pendergast has the money." The exchange happened in a blur. Pendergast handed Augusta a heavy leather satchel. Augusta counted the stacks of currency with trembling, avaricious fingers. She didn't hug Clara goodbye. She simply nodded to the solicitor and walked out into the snow, the bell above the door chiming cheerfully, mocking the devastation left in her wake. Clara felt a heavy hand on her shoulder. It was Pendergast. "The driver is waiting, Miss Ali," he said, his voice softer now, tinged with a pity that felt worse than Augusta's cruelty. "Best not to keep Silas Sterling waiting. He is not known for his patience." Clara walked out the back door of the office. The alleyway was dark, sheltered Clear's throat from the main street. A black carriage sat there, the horses snorting plumes of steam into the freezing air. The carriage had no crest, no markings. The windows were draped with heavy black curtains. The driver, a hunched man wrapped in a buffalo coat, didn't speak. He simply opened the door. Clara climbed inside. The interior was lined with crushed red velvet, surprisingly luxurious, but it felt like a coffin. As the carriage lurched forward, leaving the only home she had ever known, Clara didn't pray for salvation. She prayed for numbness. She had been sold like cattle traded for her stepmother's freedom. She told herself she would be brave. She told herself she would survive. But as the carriage left the city limits and began the steep, treacherous climb toward the jagged peaks of Dead Man's Ridge, Clara Ali realized that the cold in her heart was far deeper than the Wyoming winter. The journey took 4 grueling hours. The carriage climbed higher and higher, the wheels crunching over ice and gravel. The air grew thinner and the temperature plummeted. Outside, the landscape shifted from the rolling plains of Cheyenne to the claustrophobic embrace of pine forests and towering granite cliffs. Dead Man's Ridge was aptly named. It was a place where the sun seemed to give up early, casting long violet shadows across the snow by mid-afternoon. Clara huddled in the corner of the carriage, shivering despite the thick wool blanket she had found on the seat. Her mind raced with the rumors she had heard about Silas Sterling. He was 7 feet tall. He had claws instead of hands. He ate raw meat. The rational part of her knew these were tall tales spun by drunks, but fear has a way of making the irrational feel like gospel. Suddenly, the carriage slowed and turned through a massive iron gate. Clara peeked through a crack in the curtains. They were entering a clearing. In the center stood a house that defied the rumors of a hermit's shack. It was a sprawling 2-story structure made of dark timber and river stone, formidable and imposing against the white backdrop of the mountains. Smoke curled lazily from 3 different chimneys. It looked sturdy, impenetrable, a fortress built to keep the world out. The carriage halted in front of the main porch. The silence of the mountains was absolute, broken only by the jingle of the horse's harness. The door opened. The driver offered a gloved hand. "We're here, ma'am." Clear's throat, Clara stepped down her boots, sinking into the snow. She clutched her small Val to her chest. The front door of the house opened. It wasn't a servant who greeted her, it was him. Silas Sterling stood in the doorway, framed by the warm orange glow of the interior lamps. He was a mountain of a man, broad-shouldered and tall, wearing a dark duster coat and a black eston pulled low. Clara's breath hitched. He didn't move. He just watched her as she walked up the wooden steps. Her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. The details came into focus. He wasn't a monster with claws. He was a man wearing work gloves and clean, well-tailored clothes, but the rumors about the mask, they were partially true. A black silk bandana was tied tightly around the lower half of his face, covering his nose, mouth, and chin. Above the fabric, his eyes were visible. They were a startling, piercing shade of steel blue, framed by dark lashes. They weren't the eyes of a madman. They were the eyes of someone intensely, painfully guarded. He didn't offer a hand. He didn't bow. "You're small," he said. His voice was a low rumble, rough like gravel tumbling down a chute. It sounded like a voice that hadn't been used for conversation in years. Clara straightened her spine. Augusta had sold her, but she refused to be cowed. "I am strong, Mr. Sterling. My size is irrelevant." Something flickered in those steel blue Clear's throat, eyes. Surprise, amusement. It was gone too fast to tell. He stepped aside. "Come in, don't let the heat out." Clara stepped over the threshold. The warmth hit her instantly. The smell of pine wood, roasting coffee, and old leather. The entryway was grand but sparse. There were no paintings, no frivolous decorations, just polished wood and functional furniture. Jed, Silas barked. An older man with a limp and a white, bushy mustache appeared from a hallway. He wore a flour-dusted apron. "This must be the cook." "This is Miss Ali," Silas said, not looking at Clara. "Show her to the East Room. Dinner is at 6. I expect silence at the table." With that, Silas Sterling turned on his heel and walked toward a heavy oak door at the end of the hall. He closed it firmly behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot. Clara stood there blinking. "Well now," the old man, Jed said, wiping his hands on his apron. He gave her a kind, toothy smile. "Don't mind the boss. He's got the social graces of a grizzly bear, but he don't bite mostly. I'm Jed. I run the house. He wears a mask," Clara whispered, unable to stop herself. Jed's smile faded slightly. "He's got his reasons, miss. Old wounds, some on the skin, some deeper. You best not ask him about it. He values his privy privacy more than his gold." Jed led her up the staircase. "Augusta, your stepmother sent a telegram saying you were docile and obedient. That true?" Clara thought of the way Augusta had looked at the money. She thought of the cold carriage ride. She thought of the steel in Silas's eyes. "I was obedient," Clara said softly, her grip on the valve tightening. "I don't think I can afford to be any more." The East Room was surprisingly beautiful. It had a large four-oster bed, a roaring fireplace, and a window that looked out over the valley. It was the room of a lady, not a prisoner. But as Clara unpacked her few meager belongings, she felt the weight of the house pressing down on her. She was the wife of a man who wouldn't show his face in a house miles from civilization. At 6:00, she went downstairs. The dining table was long enough to seat 20, but it was set for 2. Silas was already seated at the head. He had removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair that curled slightly at the collar, but the black silk scarf remained in place. Clara sat to his right. The silence was deafening. Jed brought out plates of roast venison and potatoes, retreating quickly. Clara watched him. How was he going to eat? Silas seemed to sense her stare. He turned those piercing blue eyes on her. "Eat," he commanded. "I am not a dog to be ordered," Clara said, her voice shaking but clear. Silas stopped cutting his meat. He looked at her, his knife hovering over the plate. For a long, agonizing minute, the only sound was the crackling of the fire. "No," Silas said slowly. "You are not. You are a woman who was sold by her own family. I imagine you feel like a piece of property." "I feel like I am in a nightmare," Clara retorted. "Wake up then," Clear's throat, Silas said coldly. "I bought your debt, Miss O'Malley. I did not buy you. You are here because I need a housekeeper and a name on a marriage certificate to stop the territorial government from seizing my land under the bachelor's tax laws. You will run this house. You will stay out of my wing." Clear's throat, "You will stay out of my business. In exchange, you get a home, food, and protection. Is that understood?" Clara was stunned. "A marriage of convenience, that was it. So we are not husband and wife." Silas let out a short, harsh sound that might have been a laugh. "Look at me, Clara. Do you think I am a man looking for romance?" He raised a hand to his face, touching the edge of the black silk. "I am a monster. I made peace with that a long time ago. You stick to your side of the house and you'll survive." He stood up, grabbing his plate and a bottle of whiskey. "I eat alone." He walked out, leaving Clara alone at the massive table. She looked at the empty chair. He had called himself a monster. But when he had looked at her, she hadn't seen malice. She had seen a man who was desperately afraid of being seen. And for the first time since leaving Mr. Pendergast's office, Clara didn't feel fear. She felt curiosity, and that she knew was a dangerous thing in the Wild West. 3 weeks into her confinement at Dead Man's Ridge, Clara realized that silence was a physical weight. The house was vast, built of timber, so thick it seemed to absorb sound. Days were spent in a routine of solitary industry. Clara, refusing to be a mere guest in the house that owned her, took over the domestic duties from Jed. She scrubbed floors that hadn't seen soap in a decade. She beat dust from rugs that choked the air. She polished the silver until she could see her own determined reflection in the soup ladles. Jed, initially skeptical, watched her with growing respect. "You got grip, missy," Jed observed one afternoon as Clara wrestled a heavy bear-hide rug onto the porch railing for beating. "Most folks take one look at the boss and wilt like old lettuce. You just sweep harder." "Fear is a luxury I can no longer afford, Jed," Clara replied, wiping sweat from her forehead, leaving a smudge of dirt. "Besides, if I'm to be the mistress of this house in name, I intend to make it livable in practice." Silas was a phantom. He left before dawn, riding out into the brutal Wyoming winter to tend his herd of hardy Texas longhorns located in the lower pastures. He returned after dark, smelling of cold air, horse sweat, and tobacco. True to his word, he took his meals in his study, a room forbidden to Clara. She would hear the heavy thud of his boots, the creak of the study door, and then hours of silence until he retreated to his bedroom on the opposite wing. He was keeping his distance, adhering strictly to the contract he'd laid out. Yet Clara felt his presence everywhere. He was in the expensive coal that kept the house warm, the plentiful food in the larder, luxuries she hadn't known since her father's gambling debt spiraled. He was a generous captor, if nothing else. The thawing began imperceptibly. It started with a book. Cleaning the parlor one afternoon, Clara found a dusty bookshelf among the dry treatises on animal husbandry, and surveying, she found a worn copy of Jane Eyre. It was dogeared pages stained with what looked like old coffee. Inside the cover, written in a delicate looping hand, was the name Sarah Sterling, 1872. It must have belonged to his mother or sister. Family lost to the fire the town whispered about. That night, dinner was the usual silent affair, with Clara eating alone at the great table. When Jed came to collect Silas's tray to take to the study, Clara stopped him. "Wait, Jed." She went to the kitchen and retrieved a small apple tart she had baked that afternoon, dusting it with cinnamon sugar. She placed it on the tray next to the slab of roast beef. Jed raised a bushy eyebrow. "He don't eat sweets. Missy says it makes a man soft. Everyone likes sweets." "Jed, take it to him." Clear's throat, Clara waited in the parlor, pretending to read by the firelight, her heart thumping nervously. 20 minutes later, Jed returned with the tray. The beef was gone. The tart was gone, and sitting on the silver tray next to the empty plate was the copy of Jane Eyre. Clara picked it up. He must have seen her dusting the shelf. It was a small gesture, barely a ripple in the ocean of his remoteness, but it was an acknowledgement. He was watching. Emboldened, Clara began pushing the boundaries of their silent agreement. She started leaving the parlor door open in the evenings, playing soft melodies on the out-of-tune upright piano she had discovered under a tarp. She ensured fresh coffee was kept hot on the stove when she knew he was due back. Silas never thanked her. He never spoke to her beyond gruff necessities about household supplies, but he began lingering in the hallway a moment longer before retreating to his study, the scent of her baking and the sound of the piano drifting toward him. Then came the blizzard of early February. It was a white death, the kind old-timers in Laram warned about. The wind shrieked down the canyon like a banshee piling snow in drifts 10 ft high against the house. They were completely cut off. On the second day of the storm, the temperature dropped so low the window panes frosted over on the inside. Silas had been out in the barn for hours. Clara, worried the pipes might freeze, was pacing the kitchen when the back door burst open in a swirl of snow. Silas stumbled in, carrying something wrapped in his heavy canvas duster. He was covered in ice, his black mask frosted white where his breath hit the fabric. He didn't look at Clara. He went straight to the fireplace, kneeling down. He unwrapped the bundle. It was a newborn calf, barely alive, its black fur slick with amniotic fluid and ice. "Get towels," Silas barked, his voice rougher than usual. "Warm water, whiskey." Clara didn't hesitate. She grabbed supplies and knelt beside him. The calf was shaking violently, its eyes rolled back. For the next 3 hours, the monster of Dead Man's Ridge and his bought bride worked in tandem on the hearthrug. Silas rubbed down the calf with a tenderness that defied his reputation. His massive, calloused hands, capable of breaking a man's jaw, were incredibly gentle as he massaged warmth back into the small creature. At one point, he needed both hands to hold the calf steady. "Pour the whiskey," he instructed Clara into its mouth, just a dribble to get the heart pumping. Clara knelt close, the smell of pine and snow radiating off him. As she leaned in to administer the whiskey, her arm brushed against his shoulder. He flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his mask. But he didn't pull away. They worked in the intimate bubble of the firelight. The storm raging outside forgot. Clear's throat when the calf finally let out a weak bleat and tried to lift its head. Clara let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. She looked up, smiling in relief. She found Silas looking right at her. Clear's throat, his eyes, usually so guarded, were wide and vulnerable. He was close, closer than he had ever allowed himself to be. "You have good hands," he said quietly. The compliment hung in the air, heavy and startling. Clara flushed from the heat of the fire, and the intensity of the moment whispered back, "So do you, Silas." It was the first time she used his Christian name. His eyes hardened instantly. The wall slammed back up. He stood abruptly, the moment shattered. "Jed will take over," he growled, turning his back on her. "Stay away from the barn. It's dangerous." He retreated to the shadows of the hallway, leaving Clara alone with the newborn calf. But something had shifted. She had seen past the mask, past the gruff exterior. She had seen a man who would fight a blizzard to save a helpless animal, and she knew with a certainty that scared her that the monster wasn't the man hiding in the dark. The monster was whatever pain had driven him there. The storm raged for 3 days. The isolation at Dead Man's Ridge transformed from a quiet solitude into a pressure cooker. The air in the house grew thick with unspoken things. Silas became even more elusive, if that were possible. He seemed angry at himself for the moment of shared vulnerability by the fire. He spent hours shoveling a path to the barn, working with a manic energy, refusing Clara's offers of hot soup or coffee. On the 4th morning, the wind died down, leaving a world buried in blinding white silence. Clara was in the kitchen helping Jed knead dough when a terrible crash echoed from the barn, followed by a pained shout that stopped her heart. Jed dropped the dough. "Boss," they grabbed coats and ran out into the snow. The barn door was half off its hinges. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of panicked horses. A heavy support beam, likely weakened by the weight of the snow on the roof, had sheared off and fallen. Silas was on the ground, pinned beneath the thick timber. He was conscious, his face pale above the black silk mask, his teeth gritted in agony. A sleek Winchester Model 1873 rifle, which he always carried for wolves, lay just out of reach in the straw. "Don't move," Jed yelled, rushing to the beam. It took both Jed and Clara, straining with every ounce of strength they possessed, to lift the timber just enough for Silas to drag himself free. His right leg was badly twisted, but it was his left shoulder that was the problem. A jagged splinter from the beam had torn through his heavy coat and deep into the flesh. Blood, bright and alarming, was already soaking the sleeve. "I'm fine," Silas grounded out, trying to stand and immediately collapsing with a curse. "You are not fine, you stubborn fool," Clara cried, adrenaline overriding fear. She grabbed his good arm, draping it over her shoulder. "Jed helped me get him inside to the parlor, it's warmest." They half-carried, half-dragged the large man through the snow and into the house. They laid him on the velvet sofa in the parlor. He was shivering uncontrollably, now shock setting in. "Jed, I need boiling water, clean linens, and your sharpest knife." "And the whiskey bottle," Clara commanded, taking charge. The months of nursing her dying father had given her a grim familiarity with sickness and injury. Silas was fading in and out of consciousness as she cut away his ruined coat and shirt. The wound on his shoulder was ugly, deep, and jagged, filled with wood splinters and dirt. It needed to be cleaned immediately to prevent sepsis. "Silas," Clara said urgently, leaning over him. "Clear's throat, I have to clean this. It's going to hurt. Drink this." She held a glass of whiskey to his masked mouth. He slapped it away feebly. No mask. Stays on. His voice was a delirious slur. You can't drink through silk, Silas. You're going into shock. He was fighting her, his hands thrashing. He was terrified not of the pain, but of being exposed. Silas, look at me. Clara grabbed his face between her hands, forcing him to focus on her. His blue eyes were wild with panic. You are bleeding. I am your wife. Let me help you. Trust me. Something in her voice penetrated the fog of pain. He stopped fighting. He squeezed his eyes shut and gave a barely perceptible nod. With trembling fingers, Clara reached behind his head and untied the knot of the black silk bandana. The silk fell away. Clara felt the air leave her lungs. She expected horror. She expected a phantom. What she saw was a road map of tragedy burnt onto human skin. The left side of his face, from his jawline up to his cheekbone, was a landscape of thick, ropey scars. The skin was puckered and shiny, varying from pale white to angry red. It pulled slightly at the corner of his mouth, giving him a permanent, subtle grimace on that side. Part of his left ear was missing, melted away by fire. It was a devastating injury. But the right side of his face, it was strikingly handsome. A strong jaw, a high cheekbone, skin untouched by the flames that had ravaged the other half. It wasn't a monster's face. It was a broken man's face. It was the face of someone who had survived hell but left a piece of himself behind. Jed arrived with the supplies, stopping short when he saw Silas unmasked. He looked at Clara, a silent question in his eyes. Clara just shook her head slightly. Say nothing. For the next hour, Clara worked. She poured whiskey into the wound while Silas roared in agony. She used tweezers to pull out splinters of wood. She stitched the jagged edges of skin together with a needle sterilized in fire. Throughout the ordeal, Silas never opened his eyes. He lay, rigid, sweat pouring off him, enduring the pain and the agonizing shame of exposure. When it was done, Clara bandaged the shoulder neatly. She bathed his face with a cool cloth, wiping away the sweat and grime moving over the scars with the same gentle pressure she used on his unblemished skin. Only when she was finished did Silas open his eyes. He looked up at her, bracing himself for her revulsion. He waited for the flinch, the look of pity that was worse than hatred. Clara looked down at him. She was exhausted, her dress stained with his blood. She reached out and gently brushed a damp lock of hair back from his forehead. It's done, clears throat, she said softly. You're going to be all right, Silas. She didn't scream, she didn't look away. Her eyes held only a profound, achingly human compassion. Silas stared at her, bewildered. For 10 years, the mask had been his shield. Without it, he felt flayed alive. Yet this woman, this girl he had bought to settle a debt, was looking at his scars as if they were merely facts, not judgments. He reached up with his good hand, his fingers hovering near his cheek, missing the silk barrier. Why didn't you run? He rasped, his voice raw from screaming. Clara took his hand in hers, intertwining their fingers. His skin was burning hot. Because Silas, she whispered, monsters don't bleed like men and you are very much a man. Clear's throat, he closed his eyes again, but this time a single tear leaked out, tracking a hot path through the scars on his cheek. Clara stayed right there, holding his hand as the winter sun began to set, casting long shadows across the room, where the ghost of dead man's ridge had finally been exorcised. The fever broke on the 3rd night. For 2 days following the accident in the barn, Silas Sterling hovered between the world of the living and the darkness that had claimed his family 10 years prior. He tossed and turned on the velvet sofa in the parlor, murmuring names of people long dead. Sarah Mammer run the smoke. It's everywhere. Clara never left his side. She slept in the armchair, waking at every groan, every shift of his bandaged body. She bathed his face, his whole face, no longer hidden by silk and forced broth between his lips. When Silas finally woke with a lucid mind, the storm outside had passed, leaving the world suspended in a crystalline frozen silence. Sunlight streamed through the parlor windows, blindingly bright against the snow. He blinked, disoriented. The pain in his shoulder was a dull throb now, not the sharp agony of before. He tried to sit up, but a hand gently pushed him back. Easy, Silas, you'll tear the stitches. He turned his head. Clara was sitting there, dark circles under her eyes, looking exhausted but relieved. Silas reached for his face instinctively, his hand met bare skin. Clear's throat, panic surged through him, a cold, sharp spike of adrenaline. He looked at Clara, his eyes wide. I didn't put it back on, she said quietly, anticipating his fear. The wound needed to breathe, and there is no one here but me and Jed. Silas sank back into the pillows. He felt naked, exposed in a way that terrified him more than any gunfight. He turned his head away, hiding the scarred left side of his face against the cushion. You shouldn't have to look at it, he muttered, his voice raspy from disuse. I've been looking at it for 3 days. Silas, Clara said, her voice firm. Reached out, turning his chin so he had to face her. And I haven't turned to stone yet. It is just skin. It tells a story of survival, not shame. Silas looked at her, searching for deceit, for the hidden revulsion. He found none. He let out a long, shuddering breath. It wasn't an accident, he said suddenly. The confession clawed its way out of his throat. Clara stiffened. The fire 10 years ago. Everyone thinks a lantern fell in the stable. Silas stared at the ceiling, his jaw tightening. It was the Kincaid brothers, Bo and Luke Kincaid. They wanted the water rights to the ridge. My father refused to sell, so they burned us out. The room went cold despite the fire roaring in the hearth. The Kincaid brothers were powerful men in the territory, ruthless cattle barons who owned half the valley. I was 19. Silas continued, his voice devoid of emotion, which made it all the more harrowing. I woke up to the smell of smoke. I got to Sarah's room, my sister, but the roof came down. I tried to hold it up. That's how I got the burns. I couldn't save them, Clara. I couldn't save any of them. Clara covered her mouth, tears springing to her eyes. Oh, Silas, I survived, he whispered. And for 10 years I've stayed up here hoarding the land, refusing to let them have it. The mask, it reminds them of what they did. As long as the ghost is alive, they can't sleep soundly. They know I'm watching. But I'm just one man, and they are an army. You are not one man anymore, Clara said fiercely, squeezing his hand. You have a wife and you have Jed. Silas looked at her, a strange softness entering his steel blue eyes. I have a wife, he repeated, testing the words. I didn't think I wanted one. I was wrong. For the next week, a fragile, beautiful peace settled over Dead Man's Ridge. As Silas healed, the house transformed. The silence that had once been a wall between them crumbled. They ate dinner together, talking late into the night. Silas, it turned out, was well-read and possessed a dry, sharp wit that made Clara laugh until her sides ached. He didn't wear the mask inside the house anymore. He walked through the halls with his scars bared, reclaiming his home. The first time he smiled at her, a genuine crooked smile that lit up both the scarred and unblemished sides of his face. Clara felt a jolt in her chest that had nothing to do with duty and everything to do with love. But happiness in the West is often a calm before the violence. 2 weeks after the accident, Jed returned from a supply run to Laram. He rode his horse hard, the animal elthered and blowing despite the cold. He burst into the kitchen where Clara was rolling biscuits and Silas was cleaning his rifle. Jed's face was gray. Trouble, boss, Jed panted. Big trouble. Silas stood up the rifle, snapping into position. The tenderness of the last week vanished, replaced by the hardened warrior. Kincaid's worse, Jed spat. Your mother-in-law. Clara dropped the rolling pin. Augusta, she's in Laram, Jed explained, pouring himself a glass of water with shaking hands. She didn't go to San Francisco. She gambled away the $5,000 in 3 weeks at the poker tables in Denver. She came back looking for more. And when she found out the bank wouldn't lend her a dime, she went to the Kincaids. Silas's eyes went cold. What did she tell them? Everything, Jed said grimly. She told them about the house layout. She told them you're hurt. She heard rumors in town about the doctor buying supplies for a shoulder wound. And she sold them the deed to the boarding house in Cheyenne, which somehow gave them a legal loophole to challenge your water rights claim if you die without an heir. She sold me out, Clara whispered, horror washing over her. She sold us both out. Boke is gathering men, Jed warned. They aren't coming with a lawsuit, Silas. They're coming with torches. They aimed to finish what they started 10 years ago tonight. Silas looked at Clara. The fear in his eyes was back, but it wasn't for himself. Jed saddled the mare, Silas commanded. Pack a bag for Clara. You take her up the trail to the trapper's cabin on the north slope. They won't look for her there. No, Clara said. Silas spun around. Clara, this isn't a debate. These men are killers and you are injured. Clara stepped forward, grabbing the lapels of his shirt. You can't shoot with your left arm yet. You can't defend this house alone against a gang. If I leave, you die. I bought you to keep you safe, not to have you die in a gunfight. Silas roared, the scar on his face flushing red. You didn't buy me, Clara shouted back, matching his intensity. You married me and that means for better or worse. I am not Augusta. I don't run when the money runs out. This is my home, Silas. You are my husband. I am staying. Silas stared at her, stunned by her ferocity. He looked at the woman he had thought was a meek city girl. Seeing the steel backbone that held her up, he let out a ragged breath and nodded. Can you shoot? My father taught me to use a shotgun to scare off coyotes, Clara said. This is different than coyotes, Silas said grimly, walking to the gun cabinet. He pulled out a double-barreled shotgun and a box of shells. These are wolves, 2-legged ones. He handed her the weapon. It was heavy, smelling of oil and steel. Jed, Silas barked. Barricade the doors, douse the lights. If they want a war, let's show them why they should have stayed afraid of the ghost. Night fell like a hammer. The darkness at Dead Man's Ridge was absolute, the moon obscured by heavy slate-gray clouds that promised more snow. Inside the house, the atmosphere was suffocatingly tense. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight. Furniture was piled against the front and back doors. Silas, Jed, and Clara waited in the dark. Silas was positioned at the upstairs window of the master bedroom, which offered a vantage point of the clearing. He had his Winchester resting on the sill, his injured shoulder packed tight with pillows to absorb the recoil. Jed was downstairs in the kitchen, guarding the rear. Clara was in the hallway, the shotgun resting heavy in her sweating palms, tasked with watching the staircase. Hours ticked by. The grandfather clock in the hall chimed 10, then 11. "Maybe they aren't coming," Clara whispered to herself, praying it was true. Then the dog barked a sharp, strangled sound from the barn that was suddenly cut off. "They're here," Silas's voice drifted down from the darkness of the landing. "Stay low." The first sign of the attack wasn't a gunshot. It was a torch, a flaming brand, arched through the night sky, trailing orange sparks, and landed on the snowy porch. Then another, then a third. "Come out, Sterling," a voice bellowed from the treane. It was a deep, arrogant boom, Bo Kincaid. "We know you're in there. Burn out or come out." Silas didn't answer with words. He answered with the Winchester. Crack. The rifle shot echoed through the valley. A scream of pain erupted from the trees. Silas didn't miss. Open fire. Kincaid screamed. The night erupted. Bullets hammered the house, splintering the thick timber walls and shattering the upstairs windows. Glass rained down like diamonds. Clara huddled against the wainscoting, covering her ears as the deafening roar of gunfire filled the house. Silas was returning fire, his lever-action rifle working in a steady, deadly rhythm. Crack, chick, crack. He was a one-man army moving from window to make them think there were more defenders. Downstairs, the back door groaned under a heavy impact. There at the back, Jed shouted. A shotgun blast roared from the kitchen, Jed firing through the door. Clara, Silas shouted from above. "Watch the library window, it's the weak point." Clara scrambled on her hands and knees into the library. The room was dark, illuminated only by the flickering light of the torches burning on the lawn. She saw a shadow move against the glass of the French doors. A gloved hand smashed a pane, reaching in to undo the latch. Clara stood up. Her hands clear as throat were shaking, but her mind was strangely clear. She raised the heavy shotgun. "Get back!" she screamed. The man outside laughed. "Well, now looks like the little lady is home." The latch clicked. The door swung open. A man stepped in tall, wearing a long duster, a revolver in his hand. It wasn't B, it was one of his hired guns. He raised his pistol. Clara pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder, bruising her deep, but the spread of the buckshot did its job. The man was lifted off his feet and thrown back out onto the snow. Clara pumped the action, ejecting the spent shell, her hands moving on instinct. "I said get back." "Good girl," Silas yelled from the stairs, but the Kincaids had brought too many men. They were swarming the porch now. Smoke was beginning to curl under the front door. They were setting the house on fire. "The roof," Jed yelled, running into the hall. They threw a lantern on the roof shingles. The nightmare was repeating itself. The smell of burning wood, the heat, the smoke. It was exactly how Silas had lost his family. Silas came stumbling down the stairs. He was pale blood seeping through the bandage on his shoulder again. The physical exertion was tearing him apart. "We have to get out," Silas coughed, the smoke thickening rapidly. "We can't hold the house. They'll shoot us down if we run," Jed said, reloading his pistol. "Not if we go out the root cellar," Silas said. "There's a drainage tunnel that leads to the creek bed. It's tight, but we can fit." "Go," Silas ordered. "Jed, take Clara. I'll hold them off at the door." "No." Clara grabbed his arm. "We go together or not at all." "Clara, listen to me." Silas gripped her shoulders, his blue eyes burning with intensity. "The tunnel collapses if you don't shore it up from the inside. Someone has to drop the beam to seal it behind us so they can't follow. I'm the only one strong enough to move it." "You mean you're staying behind to die?" Clara screamed, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. "I'm staying behind to make sure the Kincaids don't win," Silas said. He leaned down and kissed her hard, desperate tasting of smoke and blood. "I love you, Clara. O'Malley. Now go." He shoved her toward Jed. "Take her." Jed, tears in his eyes, grabbed Clara's waist and dragged her toward the pantry where the cellar hatch was hidden. Clara fought him, kicking and screaming Silas's name, but Jed was stronger. He hauled her down into the darkness of the earth. Silas turned back to the front door. The wood was beginning to burn through. Could hear the Kincaids laughing outside, thinking they had won. Silas Sterling, the ghost of the ridge, reloaded his Winchester one last time. He wasn't afraid. He had found something worth dying for. He waited until the front door kicked inward, showering barks into the hallway. Bo Kincaid stood there framed by the inferno, a triumphant grin on his face. "End of the line, ghost," Bo shouted. Silas stepped out of the shadows. No mask, his scars glowing in the firelight. "Welcome to hell, Bo." Silas growled. He raised the rifle. Down in the tunnel, Clara heard a massive explosion, not a gunshot, but something louder, a boom that shook the earth. Silas had rigged the blasting powder stored in the entryway. "Silas," she screamed, her voice echoing in the damp tunnel. Then silence. The tunnel led them out to the frozen creek bed 200 yards from the house. Clara scrambled up the snowy bank, gasping for air. She looked back. The great timber house on Dead Man's Ridge was a pea flames shot 50 feet into the air, painting the snow blood red. The roof had collapsed. "He's gone," Jed whispered, taking off his hat. He brought the whole house down on top of them. Clara stood in the snow, the cold wind whipping her hair. She stared at the inferno, her heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. She sank to her knees, a wail of pure, unadulterated grief ripping from her throat. She had been sold to a monster, but she had fallen in love with a hero. And now he was Ash, or so she thought. Because in the Wild West, a man like Silas Sterling is hard to kill, and a woman like Clara O'Malley is never done fighting. Winter clung to the Wyoming mountains with icy claws, refusing to yield. For Clara, the months following the destruction of Dead Man's Ridge were a blur of gray skies and suffocating grief. She and Jed had taken refuge in an old trapper's cabin on the north slope, surviving on meager supplies and the few cattle they managed to round up. The Kincaid gang was dead, consumed by the inferno Silas had ignited. The town believed the ghost had died with them, taking his enemies to hell. Clara moved through the days like a specter, haunted by the memory of the fire. Augusta had sent letters through her solicitor, Pendergast, demanding Clara return to Cheyenne or face legal action. Clear's throat, Clara burned them. She wasn't leaving. It was mid-April when the nausea started. When Clara realized the truth, it hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was carrying Silas's child. The discovery ignited a spark of fury in her. She wasn't just a widow mourning a ghost. She was a mother fighting for a legacy. "Hitch the wagon, Jed," Clara ordered, one morning buckling Silas's gun belt over her hips. "We're going to town. I'm done hiding." Clear's throat, they rode into Laram mud, splattering the wheels. Clara marched straight into the land office where Augusta and Pendergast were meeting with the town marshal to finalize the seizure of the Sterling estate. "I am the heir," Clara announced, slamming her hand on the desk, interrupting Pendergast's oily speech. "And I am not liquidating anything." Augusta, dressed in theatrical mourning black, sighed. "Marshal, my stepdaughter is unstable. She is destitute. For her own good, I must take conservative of the land." "You don't want the land for me," Clara spat. "You want to sell the water rights. You sold me, and now you want to sell his memory." Augusta's eyes narrowed, dropping to the slight swell of Clara's stomach. "A bastard child. How convenient. A legitimate child." A deep, rough voice thundered from the doorway. "And if you call it a bastard again, Augusta, I'll cut out your tongue." The room went deathly silent. Standing in the doorway, blocking out the sun, was a figure that shouldn't exist. He leaned heavily on a crutch, his left arm in a sling, his face covered in soot and healing burns. It was Cass Sterling. Clara gasped, staggering back. "Silas, I told you, Clara," he rasped, limping into the room. "Monsters don't die easy." He slammed a charred, heavy ledger onto the marshal's desk. "I dropped into the root cellar before the roof collapsed. It took me 3 days to dig out, but I found this in Kincaid saddle bags before the fire. Pendergast has been falsifying deeds for the Kincaids for years, and Augusta is his accomplice." The marshal flipped through the ledger, his expression hardening. He looked at Pendergast, who was sweating profusely, and gestured to his deputies. "Arrest them!" Augusta screamed as she was dragged away. But Clara didn't hear her. She was already in Silas's arms. He held her with a desperate strength, burying his face in her hair. "I thought you were gone," she sobbed. "Never," Silas whispered. "I had to finish it. I had to make sure you were safe." He pulled back his trembling hand, reaching out to touch her stomach. "Is it true, a baby?" Clara nodded, smiling through tears. Silas Sterling, the man who had hidden from the world for a decade, looked at his wife and wept openly in front of the entire town. The rebuilding of Dead Man's Ridge began that spring. The new house was built with large windows to let the light in, banishing the shadows of the past. Silas's scars remained, but he no longer wore the mask. He had no need to hide. 6 months later, their son Leo was born. As Silas sat on the porch one evening, rocking the boy to sleep, while Clara read beside him, he looked out at the valley. The stepmother's greed had bought Clara's slavery, but it had inadvertently purchased their salvation. They had walked through the fire and come out the other side, not unscathed, but together. And in the Wild West, that was the only victory that mattered. The legend of Silas and Clara Sterling is a testament to the fact that true love is not found in fairy tales, but in the trenches of shared survival. Clara was sold as a commodity, a debt to be paid, but she possessed a worth that no currency could measure. Silas was a man defined by his trauma, hiding behind a mask of silk and silence until a woman with eyes full of courage forced him to step into the light. Their story reminds us that monsters are often just people who have been hurt too deeply, and that redemption isn't about erasing the scars of the past, but about finding someone who loves the map they make on your soul. In the end, the stepmother's greed bought Clara's freedom, and the cowboy's possession became his salvation. They built a life not on the absence of pain, but on the presence of a love that was stronger than fire. If this story of grit, betrayal, and undying love touched your heart, please take a moment to hit that like button. It helps us bring more untold stories of the Wild West to life. Did you suspect Silas was alive, or did the twist catch you off guard? Let me know in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss a saga. Share this video with a friend who loves a good romance drama. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you on the next.